Welcome to ArchaeoEd, a podcast about ancient civilizations in the Americas. I'm your host, Dr. Ed Barnard, and I've been an archaeologist all around the Americas for over 20 years now. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about ancient civilizations that I find interesting. Sometimes it'll be overviews, sometimes it'll be very in-depth information, basically anything I feel like talking about, because this is my podcast and I'm just having fun with it. I hope you enjoy it too. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and let's get started. Episode 1. The Nazca. The Nazca are a people who lived in southern Peru about 2,000 years ago. They're most famous for creating the Nazca lines, but there's so much more to appreciate about their civilization. I'll talk about the Nazca lines in a bit, but first let's discuss some basic facts that place them in time, space, and the larger Andean cultural continuum. The Nazca were in southern Peru, in the desert hills well inland from the coastline. Peru is a north-south running country on the west coast of South America, and it can be broken up into basically three broad regions. There's the desert running along the Pacific coast with lots of river valleys running through it and down into the ocean. There's the Andes Mountains, and then there's the Amazon's west edge as it runs into the Andes. Many amazing civilizations developed in the fertile river valleys of the coastal deserts, and the Nazca were one of them. They lived about 70 kilometers inland, though still in a river valley. They probably settled there in response to El Niño events that had devastated the culture just before them, the Paracas people. Nazca civilization lasted from about 100 BCE to 800 CE. That's 900 years. Not too shabby, really. Of course, those start and end dates are a bit fuzzy. Civilizations don't just happen, or usually they don't suddenly end. It's a process of slow change over generations, and sometimes archaeology has a hard time seeing a hard line, so we make these generalities. And the Nazca didn't just start from scratch. They were the clear descendants of the Paracas people who lived on the coast from 900 to 100 BCE. Not only do their time periods link up very smoothly, but you can actually follow the river valley that's in the middle of the Paracas heartland on the coast. You can track it back into the desert and off to a little offshoot that becomes the Nazca River running through the Nazca Valley. They share a lot of material culture similarities too. Things like textile traditions, similar art iconography, and shaft tombs. There's a lot of other things too. And I'll probably do a whole episode on the Paracas in the future, but for now, we'll keep our focus on the Nazca. So, they started with the fall of the Paracas civilization, who probably had to abandon their region due to El Niño storms destroying their crops and spoiling their regular fishing patterns. The end of the Nazca may well too have been El Niño related. It certainly was a factor in the demise of the Moche to their north, and that happened about the same time as the demise of the Nazca. But the other probable cause was an invasion of people from the mountains, the Wari civilization. The Wari evolved in the region just above and to the east of Nazca, a state today called Ayacucho. Starting about 650 CE, the Wari were the Andes' first truly expansionistic empire. In many ways, they were the model that the Inca would later take to the next level. By 800 CE, their expansion plans crystallized, and the Nazca were the nearest culture upon which to impose them. We can see it in the kinds of new buildings in Nazca, the change in diet, the change in burial patterns. The Nazca were definitely supplanted by the Wari. Another good orientation question to ask is, who were the contemporary cultures of the Nazca? They definitely weren't living in a bubble. There were other cultures all around them. To the north were the mighty Moche people. It was a vast region of independent city-states. They lived along the coast, from Lima almost all the way up to the modern border of Ecuador. They existed during almost the exact same time period as the Nazca. The Moche were roughly 100 to 800 CE. But the Moche settled much closer to the coast, and again, El Niños were probably a major factor in their demise. We can see through Moche religious iconography that both Nazca and Moche were worshipping the same deity, a figure I call the Fang deity. But the Moche had a decidedly more warlike culture. The Moche probably would have dominated and absorbed the Nazca had geography not dissuaded them. The Moche influence went as far south as modern-day Lima, but then there's a stretch of considerably less fertile river valleys hitting the coast. Even today, it's a 6-hour drive through mostly desert between Lima and Nazca. In a way, it was a testimony to the success of the Nazca strategy. Their remote, difficult-to-master region insulated them from the outside world, at least for a time. That buffer zone was even more apparent to the south and east. To the south along the coast was increasingly dry desert, right down into the Atacama Desert itself. Virtually no one lives there, even in modern times. To the east was the Andes, a particularly barren stretch of them. It wasn't until the Wari mastered agricultural terracing that anything more than tiny farmsteads could take hold there. To find other contemporary cultures of the Nazca, we have to look to Lake Titicaca at the top of the Andes and well to the southeast, about 600 kilometers away. Things were different up there, and the Nazca time frame spans over a major cultural evolution, from a culture called Yanomama into the Tiwanaku civilization. Yanomama culture builds stone ceremonial complexes with carved monoliths and open plazas, from about 800 BCE up to about 400 CE. Pucara, on the north end of the lake, is one of their biggest settlements. Then around 500 CE, the great city of Tiwanaku emerges at the south end of the lake. Tiwanaku was an amazing place, full of megalithic architecture and a raised field agriculture system that supported its population. Its population was at least 30,000 people, and some archaeologists argue it's more like 70,000 people at its peak. They traded widely, but mostly with people from the Amazon, not really the Nazca. Well, at least not that archaeology's been able to detect so far. But one thing that both Yanomama and Tiwanaku hold in common with Nazca is images of that Fang deity. If you listen to my podcast enough, you'll realize that the Fang deity is a topic that I'm obsessed with. I think that he's the monotheistic deity of all the Andean civilizations, right up until European contact. But okay, what about today in the Nazca Valley? Well, there's a sizable community there and a city called Nazca. And it's actually getting bigger all the time because people are moving down from the mountains to be part of Nazca City. They attach themselves to the outskirts, one neighborhood at a time. The people that are there are ethnically the same people who were there at European contact. They're Nazca heritage people who, in their latest manifestation, were dominated by the Inca, and they speak Quechua. They themselves say that Quechua is a Nazca language that the Inca inherited, not vice versa. And even though that seems strange, I haven't heard any linguists denying that yet, so maybe that's true. The people there are... Some of them are farmers, but most of them are just living in regular towns and having regular town jobs, like restaurants, shops, hotels, things like that. Mining's another major source of employment in the Nazca area, but it's dangerous and underpaid, so there's a lot of social unrest about it. Once when I was there visiting, the unhappy miners were blocking the highway in protest. But, being the kind folks they were, they let the tourists pass. Then, of course, tourism is an important part of the Nazca modern economy as well. Thousands of people from all around the world come every month to fly out of their tiny airport and over the famous Nazca lines. Okay, I've got to take a break. When I return, I'll talk about those Nazca lines, what they were, how they were created, and some of the ideas about why they were made. This break is where commercials should go. But until I find people who'd like to buy the time, I'll just promote what I'm doing. If you like the cultures and places I'm talking about in this podcast, you should consider traveling with my colleagues and I. I'm the director of Maya Exploration Center, a nonprofit dedicated to the better understanding of ancient American civilizations. We do that through things like this podcast, our website, public lectures, and educational travel programs like I just mentioned. If you'd like to find out more about how to get involved, or just give us a donation to continue our work, check us out at www.mayaexploration.org. That's mayaexploration.org. Okay, it's the moment probably most of you have been waiting for. Let's talk about the Nazca lines. First of all, what are they? Simply stated, they're gigantic drawings etched into the desert. The archaeological term is geo-glyphs, meaning basically symbols drawn onto the earth. The Nazca people carved hundreds of these geoglyphs into the desert plateaus in and around their valley, perhaps thousands of them. Many were in fact erased by wind and water. There are essentially three types of geoglyphs: long lines, geometric shapes, and biomorphic forms, meaning basically animals, humans, and plants. Why they made them is still a subject of theory and debate. But when they were made, and the fact that the Nazca themselves made them, is abundantly provable by archaeology. I know that some of you have seen me on episodes of Ancient Aliens, and I intentionally accept their invitations in the hopes that people will follow my name back to more academically founded information. But let me be totally crystal clear here. I do not believe that aliens had anything to do with making the Nazca lines. They didn't make them, and they definitely didn't use them as landing strips. From above, the Nazca lines are like a bowl of spaghetti. Certainly nothing that a pilot could use to land. So, how do we know that the Nazca made them? Well, it's because they left their lunches and trash in the lines themselves. There are sherds of Nazca-style pottery, cooked animal bones, and even wood fragments in some of the lines. All of it produces date ranges from mostly 200 to 600 CE. Those datable artifacts are also solidly debunking claims that the Nazca lines were made 10,000 or more years ago. They just weren't. The Nazca made them, and making them was surprisingly easy to do. Aside from El Niño events, the Nazca Valley is extremely dry. It gets less than 4 millimeters of rainfall per year. Some years, not a single drop falls. The ground is covered with these reddish-brown rocks, burned that color from millennium of sunlight. Underneath those rocks is a yellowish-tan sand. The rocks are pebble size up to about the size of your fist, not very big and easily moved. Scraping the rocks to one side reveals the yellow sand, creating a big color contrast. And that's how the lines were made, simply scraping those dark rocks off the brighter colored sand. I've actually done it myself. The Nazca lines are protected in a park, but the whole region has the same geology. So on one of my trips, I pulled off the side of the road near a trash dump and made a quick video for the Great Courses lecture series I was making. With the side of my boot, I dragged my foot through the rocks, revealing the yellow sand. In less than 2 minutes, I had made a 4-meter wide rectangle. I drove by it a few years later, and there it was, just like I had made it yesterday. Now, what I made was small and honestly kind of ugly. The Nazca lines are huge, and some of them are very elaborate designs. Many people have suggested that the only way they could be made is if their makers could have seen them from above in the sky. But frankly, that's nonsense. How do we design a highway or a large office building today? Do we get in an air balloon and look down? No, of course not. We use blueprints or drawings to scale. The Nazca were smart, certainly capable of understanding the concept of scale drawings. They could draw a geoglyph plan on a llama skin or a textile and then translate it onto the earth. In the same way a typical modern engineering diagram has something like 1 centimeter equals 1 meter, they could have done the same. To go from plan to ground, it's just a process of rudimentary surveying. Strings strung between stakes, the kind you see at any modern construction site. And in fact, that's exactly what archaeologists have found. Stakes tied with strings inside the lines. Thanks to the dry area of the Nazca Desert, those stakes and strings survived to be found and dated. And, no surprise, they dated to around 600 CE. So, the evidence indicates that the Nazca laid out patterns with survey lines of string and then simply moved the reddish rocks around side to side to create those lines. Mystery solved, at least in part. Of course, the harder question to answer is why the Nazca made the lines. To investigate that question, a logical first step would be to look at what kinds of things they chose to draw onto the desert. There are basically three types of things the Nazca depicted: lines, geometric shapes, and biomorphic figures. Of the hundreds of known Nazca geoglyphs, lines are by far the most common, over 800 of them. Some lines were less than 100 meters long, but others went on for kilometers. The longest lines recorded are almost 30 kilometers long. Some lines emanate from a single point in a kind of radial pattern. Still others parallel each other. The next most common geoglyph type is the geometric shapes. There are about 300 of those on the Nazca Plains. The majority of the geometric type are elongated rectangles and trapezoids. Those are the ones that inspired some people to believe that they're landing strips. And again, I don't subscribe to that theory. There are many other geometric shapes as well. Spirals, zigzags, even a complex of squares, circles, and triangles that looks very much like a Hindu mandala. Now, the smallest category of Nazca geoglyphs are the images of animals, plants, and humans, the ones we collectively call biomorphs. Archaeologists love to make up fancy terms for simple stuff. It makes us look smart. Of course, that's every field of science. Medicine is one of the worst. Once in an ER, a doctor told me I had facial angioedema. I said, "Do you mean my face is swelled up?" "Well, yeah, I know that already. That's why I came in." But anyway, there's a little over 70 of these biomorph-type Nazca lines, and they're by far the most famous. And their fame is well-deserved. They're fantastic. There's a spider, a dog, a whale, a condor, and many more made with great care and precision. Most, but not all of them, were made with one continuous line, which seems to indicate they were created in a ritual route of sorts. So there's a huge variety of subject matter in the Nazca lines, and frankly, that doesn't help us figure out what they were made for. The variety seems more like artistic expression rather than an adherence to a repeated religious rite or some more practical purpose. And what's more, the lines on top of the Nazca Plateau are not the only ones in the area. There's also the Palpa lines, just to the north on another plateau. And the Palpa lines have yet other figures, like a group of 8 humanoid images. And there are many, many more lines there. I've flown over both groups of lines, and what one sees when doing that is illuminating. For one thing, those 2 plateaus were not the only places where lines were etched into the desert. They're merely the places where sufficient rain runoff couldn't erase them. As I flew over, I could see many places where fluvial fans covered gently inclined land with fragments of the lines poking through sections where the water never passed. That suggests that there weren't merely hundreds of lines, but once there were thousands. The other thing that an actual flyover makes clear is that the lines and geoglyphs cover older ones again and again. New lines did not have to respect older ones. Photos of individual drawings and the most famous figures like the spider or the hummingbird don't really show the chaotic nature of the many, many crossing over and partially erasing lines. It's like there's no order whatsoever to them. Whatever the lines were, they were not a single work. They were individual acts that did not need to respect or even recognize older ones. Whatever the power the lines had, it disappeared by the time the next group of devotees arrived to make new ones. So back to the question, why were they made? Spanish conquistadors saw them in the 1500s and forwarded the earliest faulty theory. They thought they were old roads like the ones the Inca had built. Then centuries passed before anyone said another word about them. It wasn't until the 1920s when Peruvian archaeologists saw them from the foothills above, and yes, they can be seen from the mountains, not just air. Then in the 1940s, American historian Paul Kossak flew over them in a plane. Soon after, he recruited archaeologists Richard Shadell and Marie Reich to help him systematically record them. By the way, decades later, I was the student of Richard Shadell at the University of Texas. He didn't really like me, especially my early papers about the Fang deity. He thought it was nonsense. But oh well. They say that if everybody likes you, then you're probably not doing anything important. Anyway, those three came up with the first professional theories about the lines in the 1940s and 50s. They said they were astronomically aligned, and indeed, there are a handful of lines that point to horizon risings and settings of the solstices, equinoxes, lunar stations, and even a few planets. Kossak and Shadell moved on to other projects, but Maria Reich remained a champion of the Nazca lines for the rest of her life. She bought a house just outside of Nazca and fought for their protection and preservation. In 1994, her efforts paid off in the form of a UNESCO World Heritage status for the Nazca lines. Now there's a park protecting them all from vehicle and even foot traffic. She died in 1998. But her house is now a museum dedicated to the lines and the story of her efforts to protect and study them. But those astronomical theories at first brought more outlandish ones. In particular, Eric von Donigen's 1968 book, The Chariots of the Gods. That was the first, but not nearly the last, suggestion that the Nazca lines were calling down aliens to Earth. It also attracted other archaeoastronomers. Notably, Gerald Hawkins and Anthony Aveni. Both men were dubious about the Nazca line's astronomical functions. Aveni published books in the 90s detailing his argument and why he disagreed. In a nutshell, he said that when you have hundreds of lines going in every possible direction, it's just logical that a few will randomly hit astronomical alignments. And honestly, I have to agree with him. Maybe a few were intentionally aligned, but that can't explain all the lines. That's really not why the Nazca lines were made. The other popular theory is that the lines are pointing to sources of underground water. From the 1980s into the 2000s, multiple studies have forwarded this water hypothesis, ranging from suggestions that the animal forms are associated to the worship of water deities, to people using divining rods to prove that there's water under the surface in the direction the lines point. But none of them have actually demonstrated a link between actual water sources and the lines. And to me, well, let's say I'm just not convinced. So what do I think? Well, thanks for asking. But seriously, I don't know. I don't know what to think. That being said, I have a simple theory that makes sense to me. Ancient Andean societies, all of them, are very community-oriented. They celebrate community work projects, and they participate in pilgrimages and festivals to celebrate community. To me, the lines are probably annual pilgrimages by discrete communities. They went out to the desert and together created works of art to honor their creator deity who they believed lived in the sky. And it was important for them to make something new and unique every time, hence the great variety of subject matter. Okay, well, I've got to take a break here, but when I return, I'll talk about further evidence of the Nazca's communal activities and why using the lines to indicate water sources makes absolutely no sense. The ancient Maya calendar. I'm fascinated by it, and though I've been studying it for decades, I still learn new things about it all the time. I call it ancient, but I and literally millions of modern Maya people are still tracking it into modern time. Towards that end, I've created 2 products to help people better understand it: my annual Maya wall calendar and an iPhone app called simply Maya Calendar. Through these tools, you can figure out today's date, or tomorrow's, or a Maya date thousands of years in the past. The app will even calculate your Maya birthday, and tell you about your personality traits and destiny according to modern Maya daykeeper priests. The Maya Calendar app is available through iTunes, but both it and my annual Maya wall calendar are available through my website, Mayan-calendar.com. That's Mayan with an N, calendar.com. Check it out. Okay, for this last segment, let's talk about life in the Nazca region. First, where do the people who made the Nazca lines live? Archaeologists have done extensive surveys and found hundreds of little villages and a few major centers. Collectively, the ancient Nazca population is estimated at about 25,000 people total. The villages are all pretty small, usually covering no more than 4 acres each. The houses are mostly set up on terraces in the hillsides. They're right next to the floodplains that were left open for farming. The houses themselves are sometimes made of adobe or stone, but most often they're made of thatch and wood. The thatch comes from natural grasses in the valley, and the wood comes from the local huarango tree. It's a kind of mesquite tree, but it can live for almost 1,000 years. Using those trees for building material was probably a mistake, and I'll get back to that point in a moment. Settlement in the Nazca Valley area was not uniform. There were many small villages, a few mid-sized to large villages, and one notably larger center. We call that one Ventilla. Ventilla covered an area of almost 2 square kilometers. It had hundreds of contiguous residential terraces, several mid-sized pyramids, and a central plaza enclosed by a wall. There were good photos taken of it in the 1940s, but then in the 1970s, locals planted lots of huarango trees all over it in an attempt to make the land farmable again. Underneath Ventilla and the villages were tombs. Some of them were shaft tombs like the Paracas before them had made, but most of them were these square pits that were dug 3 to 4 meters deep, and they had wooden roofs. Both kinds would hold multiple mummies. They could be opened back up, and more mummies would be inserted. They seemed to be kind of family crypts of sorts. That's where archaeologists have found most of the Nazca artifacts, and the Nazca people themselves. The mummies were typically wrapped in amazing textiles, both weaved and white-painted mantles with elaborate scenes. Beautiful work. But the pottery found inside those tombs is also amazing. It's recognized as some of the finest ancient pottery in all of the Andean world. It's very thin-walled and delicate, and the Nazca pioneered a pre-firing painting technique. The Paracas before them and their contemporary Moche were first firing, and then they were painting over it. But the Nazca managed to paint pottery in a wide variety of colors, then fire it, and finally polish it for a very shiny surface. It's amazing and beautiful stuff. The other thing in those tombs was, of course, the bodies. Both complete mummies and many severed heads. And due to the extreme dry of the Nazca Desert, the bodies desiccated, often leaving skin and hair. From the mummies, we learned that many, but not all of the Nazca practiced cranial deformation, meaning they squished their skulls with boards as babies, so they had pointy, elongated shapes. The other amazing and somewhat macabre thing in the tombs were the severed heads, commonly referred to as trophy heads. They're called trophy heads because the assumption is that they were taken in combat. That's not an unreasonable assumption, but they also seem to be associated with religion. For one thing, a significant number of the skulls are deformed, indicating that they were local Nazca people, not some foreign enemy. Another thing is that we see these trophy heads depicted on Nazca pottery and textiles. In those images, they're shown with ropes going through the heads to hang them or hold them or put them on your belt. The real heads in the graves also have holes right where those ropes would go. Sometimes they are depicted with men holding weapons, but other times they're with people who look more like shamans. And then there are other depictions, many of them, that show the heads with a deity that Nazca scholars often refer to as the oculate being. He's a principal deity called oculate because of his big round eyes. To me, this is the same deity depicted by many Andean cultures, and often also holding weapons and severed heads. This is the god that I call the Fang deity, and I believe he may well be the inspiration for all of this headhunting. One more thing to note about Nazca tombs. A study of over 200 of them could not detect much in the way of social stratification. All of them had those really nice ceramics, some more than others, but there were no notably richer tombs of elites or rulers. That seems to indicate that the Nazca were relatively egalitarian and communal, not the kind of haves and have-nots like we see in so many ancient civilizations, and for that matter, in modern times. But now, let me change gears. There's one big Nazca city that I haven't mentioned, and that's because it's different than the rest. Its name is Kawachi. It's a big place on the south banks of the Nazca River. It has 40 terraced pyramids and big open plazas, but strangely, there are no residential structures there. Instead, archaeologists have found lots of fine pottery, plates, bowls, and cups, along with huge buried pits of food refuse, beans, corn, pumpkin, animal bones, all sorts of things. The conclusion is that Kawachi was a ceremonial gathering place at which the Nazca met to have great feasts and probably other festivals. What's more, it's right next to the plateau holding the Nazca lines. In fact, one of the Nazca lines that they call Camino de Leguía is essentially a road going directly between Kawachi and the other large city in the area, Ventilla. Could it be that the Nazca gathered there to plan and celebrate before making new Nazca lines? To me, I think that's entirely possible. But I don't want to slip back into Nazca line theories. Instead, I want to talk about what I've left for last, my favorite thing about the Nazca, and that's their amazing aqueduct system. Nazca farmers had a problem. They could plant in the floodplains along the rivers, but that really wasn't a reliable source of water. The rivers flowed okay in January through April, but then they dried up for the rest of the year, and some years they didn't flow at all. To solve that problem, the Nazca dug deep into the earth, tapping into underground water sources running through fault lines from way up in the mountains. They would dig down to the proper level, sometimes 15 to 20 meters down, and then they would excavate tunnels horizontally until they struck the water-filled vaults. The tunnels were then extended out to transport the water far off, in some cases kilometers away. Locally, these tunnels, these aqueducts, are called puquillos, and there are 36 of them still functioning today. The modern local farmers in the valley still depend on them. Some sections of the puquillos come close enough to the surface to become open trenches, but deeper sections were accessed through circular, spiraling ramps called ojos. Those ojos provide access, let air flow into the puquillos, and they also allowed for the frequent maintenance and cleanouts that they required. I've visited a few of these puquillos myself and climbed down into the ojos to watch the water flow underneath. They're always surrounded by lush, green, growing crops, like an oasis in the desert. Taken as a complete system, these Nazca aqueducts are an example of absolutely amazing ancient hydraulic engineering. Not only did the Nazca seal them with cobblestone walls to prevent water loss, they managed to determine the perfect pitch to control the flow rate for kilometers. If they made it too shallow, the water could stop. If they made it too steep, it could easily silt. It's not as easy as it sounds. The Nazca made Nazca lines by kicking around a few rocks, but the puquillos were a feat to rival even modern engineers. And we still don't know how many are out there, Virtually no excavations have been done, but satellite images indicate there were at least 50 Poquillos. Many of them have sadly been destroyed by modern constructions. And ironically, the Poquillos might have been the catalyst that led to the demise of the Nazca. More Poquillos led to more arable land, and with that there were more villages. The villages had more houses built of the wood of the huarango trees, some of which had roots going 50 meters down. When they chopped down all the trees, they created erosion, and it left them prey to the destructive forces of El Niños. When the El Niño rains came, the trees weren't there to hold the soil. They destroyed their crops and all of their magnificent hydraulic infrastructure. Archaeologists have found forests of huarango tree stumps, indicating that indeed they did chop them all down. Buried layers of pollen show a shift from only huarango trees, then slowly to half trees, half crops. Then the pollen was all the crops, and then the upper layers are sterile soil. There's nothing being planted at all, and the Nazca were probably not there either. They ruined their cropland. And when the Wari showed up to dominate them, they were probably too weak to resist. And just like that, the Nazca civilization came to an end. You've been listening to ArchaeoEd, a podcast about ancient civilizations of the Americas. If you liked what you heard, then do all those things that I'm supposed to ask you to do, like subscribe, share, leave a review, and rate it. If you didn't like it, then don't do any of that stuff. This podcast was conceived, produced, and edited by me, Dr. Ed Barnhart, with the occasional help of my children, who are more tech-savvy and definitely cooler than I. All rights reserved. Copyright 2019.